Good evening. Tonight we wade into the gritty, the uncertain and the not-so-glorious side of medicine. Forget the Hollywood versions of strung-out artists and desperate street corners. Forget the sanitized pharmaceutical advertisements and the carefully worded press releases. This story begins not in the shadows, but in the gleaming laboratories of the world's most trusted pharmaceutical companies. The truth is, presented with its promise, you, like millions of others, would have called it a miracle. Picture this. It's 1898. You're a mother in Victorian America. Your child has been coughing for weeks. A deep, rattling cough that keeps the entire household awake. Tuberculosis is ravaging your neighbourhood. Pneumonia has already taken your neighbour's daughter. You're terrified. You walk into your local pharmacy and the chemist behind the counter, a respectable man in a white coat, hands you a small glass bottle. The label reads "Buy a heroin" in elegant script. For children's coughs, he assures you. Perfectly safe, non-addictive, better than codeine. You pay your nickel, take it home, and give your child a spoonful of the sweet glycerin syrup. Within an hour, the cough stops. Your child sleeps peacefully for the first time in weeks. It feels like a miracle, and you would have been right to think so, at least for that night. What you wouldn't know, what you couldn't know, is that you've just given your child one of the most addictive substances ever synthesized by human hands. A substance that would go on to destroy millions of lives, tear apart families, fuel organized crime, fund terrorist organizations, and kill more than 500,000 Americans in the past 25 years alone. You wouldn't know that the company that sold you that bottle, that trusted name, Bayer, had conducted virtually no long-term studies on the substance. That they knew, or should have known, that it was chemically identical to morphine, just delivered faster and more intensely to the brain. That within a decade, your child could be one of thousands of heroin habitués, desperate, sick, and unable to function without the drug. But here's the thing, you weren't stupid, you weren't reckless, you were doing exactly what any reasonable person would do, trusting the experts, trusting the science, trusting the institutions that society had built to protect you, and those institutions, those experts, those trusted names, had failed you catastrophically. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, silence your phone, and let's step into tonight's journey together. This is not just the history of a drug. This is the history of one of humanity's greatest betrayals. A betrayal by the institutions we trusted most. This is the story of how a cure became a curse, how a medicine became a menace, and how the pursuit of profit destroyed more lives than any war. This is the real history of heroin. Part 1. Ancient Origins, the Poppy and the Dream. Chapter 1. Mesopotamia and the Joy Plant. Long before there was a molecule, a name, or a syringe, there was a flower, a deceptively simple thing. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bearing poppy. It stands a few feet high, its stem a pale, waxy green, almost blue in the haze of a summer afternoon. At its top sits the flower, a delicate cup of petals, sometimes white, sometimes a blushing pink, or a deep, bruised purple. The petals are as thin as parchment and flutter in the slightest breeze. But the petals are not the prize. After they fall away, they leave behind the pod, a small crowned globe, a seed head that swells with the promise of new life, and something more. Inside this globe, a network of fine vessels carries a milky white latex, a bitter sap. For millennia, this was humanity's most profound and intimate relationship with a plant. The story begins here, in this sap. It begins in the soft, fertile earth between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what we now call Iraq. In the long, slow dawn of civilization, around 3400 BC, the Sumerians cultivated these fields of nodding flowers. They knew the secret of the pod. With a small, sharp knife, they would make shallow, careful incisions in its skin. Almost immediately, the white milk would begin to weep, beading on the surface like tears. Left in the sun, it would thicken and darken, turning into a sticky brownish gum. This was opium, raw and unrefined. They had a name for this plant, a name that tells you everything you need to know about their relationship with it. They called it Hulgil, the joy plant, They pressed it into tablets and prescribed it for all manner of ailments, from intractable coughs to the deep gut-wrenching pains of dysentery. But its greatest gift was oblivion, a gentle, painless slide into sleep, away from the troubles of a harsh and unforgiving world. The knowledge of the joy plant was precious, a piece of divine technology passed down from healer to healer. From Mesopotamia, it began to travel. It moved with the caravans, a small dark brick of solace tucked into saddlebags, traded for copper, for timber, for textiles. It made its way to the great empires of the Nile. In Egypt, the poppy found a new and fervent following. Physicians, who were also priests, administered opium with a reverence usually reserved for the gods. The famous Eber's Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, dating back to around 1550 BC, contains over 700 remedies for various ailments. Dozens of these remedies include opium, that was prescribed to soothe crying children, a practice that would echo with terrifying consequences thousands of years in the future. It was used in elaborate religious rituals, a key to unlock the doorways of the mind. The poppy was so integral to Egyptian culture that it was buried with pharaohs, a final comfort for their long journey into the afterlife. The trade routes broadened. Phoenician sailors, the great merchants of the ancient world, carried opium in their ships across the Mediterranean. They took it to Carthage, to Spain, and most importantly to Greece. Chapter 2. Greek and Roman Medicine. Here, in the cradle of Western thought, opium was not just a medicine. It was woven into the very fabric of mythology and philosophy. The Greeks associated the poppy with gods of sleep and dreams, Hypnos and Morpheus. It was also linked to Thanatos, the god of death, a recognition of its dual nature. It could bring gentle sleep, but too much could bring a sleep from which one never woke. They understood the razor's edge. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, dismissed the magical thinking surrounding illness, but he did not dismiss opium. In his writings from around 400 BC, he praised its utility as a painkiller and as a styptic, an agent to stop bleeding. He codified its use, lending it a new air of scientific respectability. Under Hippocrates' influence, opium became a standard tool in the Greek physician's arsenal, prescribed for everything from headaches to epilepsy. By the time the Roman Empire rose to dominate the known world, opium was perhaps the most widely used and effective drug in the physician's arsenal. The city of Rome itself was a massive consumer. The legions marched with it, small leather pouches of opium paste carried by every field medic. Doctors used it to treat the wounds of the battlefield, to ease the pain of surgery performed without anesthesia, to calm the nerves of soldiers before battle. In the teeming city, street vendors sold it alongside bread and wine. It was available to anyone with a few coins. The wealthy mixed it with expensive wines. The poor chewed raw opium balls. It was democracy in chemical form, relief from pain and suffering available to patrician and plebeian alike. The most famous physician of the Roman era, Galen of Pergamon, was a true believer. He saw opium as a near panacea, a cure for everything from headaches and epilepsy to snake bites and melancholy. He famously included it in his legendary concoction, theriac, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients that was the gold standard of Roman medicine. Galen's writings would be preserved and studied for the next 1500 years, and with them, the unimpeachable reputation of opium. It was, quite simply, the mother of all medicines. For centuries, this was the state of affairs. The dark gum of the poppy was a constant, a reliable friend in a world of pain. Its power was undeniable, but also unpredictable. The potency of one batch of opium could vary wildly from the next, depending on the soil, the weather, the time of harvest, the skill of the farmer. A dose that brought relief one day might be fatal the next. It was a powerful but blunt instrument. Medicine was an art, not a science, and the use of opium was its highest and most dangerous expression. Chapter 3. Medieval to Renaissance Europe. As the Roman Empire fell and Europe descended into the Middle Ages, much of the classical knowledge was lost, but not opium. The Arabs, who had preserved Greek and Roman medical texts, continued to use and trade opium. By the time of the Crusades, opium had returned to Europe, brought back by knights and merchants who had encountered it in the Holy Land and the bazaars of Constantinople. In the 16th century, a Swiss-German physician named Paracelsus created a preparation he called laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol. The The name comes from the Latin laudare, meaning to praise, and Paracelsus praised it extravagantly. He claimed it could cure almost any disease, and even hinted that he had discovered the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary substance that could grant immortality. This was hyperbole, but laudanum was indeed a powerful medicine. The alcohol made the opium more soluble and easier to dose. It also made it easier to disguise the bitter taste. Laudanum became the standard form of opium medicine in Europe and later in America. By the 17th and 18th centuries, it was as common in European households as aspirin is today. Doctors prescribed it for everything: pain, insomnia, anxiety, diarrhea, coughs. It was given to teething babies, to women suffering from hysteria, to men with gout. It was cheap, effective, and universally available. But this ubiquity came with a cost. By the Victorian era of the 19th century, opium addiction was rampant, particularly among the middle and upper classes. In England, the problem was especially acute. Laudanum was sold in every chemist's shop, often mixed with other ingredients to create proprietary medicines with names like Godfrey's Cordial or Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup is particularly worth examining because it reveals the depth of society's ignorance, or willful blindness, about opium. The syrup was marketed specifically for teething babies and fussy children. Mothers were told to give a few drops to quiet a crying infant. What they weren't told was that the syrup contained a significant dose of morphine, opium's most active ingredient. The baby would indeed stop crying because they were unconscious. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of infants died from respiratory depression caused by overdosing on these soothing syrups. The deaths were often attributed to natural causes or labelled simply as infant mortality, which was high in that era for many reasons. Victorian England also saw the rise of what might be called literary opium addiction. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, is perhaps the most famous account. De Quincey described in vivid, hallucinatory prose his decades-long addiction to laudanum. He wrote, "Of the sublime pleasures of the drug, the sense of profound peace, the intensification of music and colour, the sense of infinite time and space." But he also wrote of the horror of addiction, the physical sickness, the mental anguish, the sense of being trapped in a cycle from which there was no escape. Other literary figures fell into the same trap. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet who wrote Kubla Khan, was a lifelong opium addict. He began using laudanum for pain relief and never stopped. His productivity declined, his health deteriorated, and his personal life collapsed. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the Victorian poet, used laudanum throughout her adult life, prescribed initially for a spinal injury. She continued using it until her death, despite its obvious effects on her health. But here's the crucial point. These were not street addicts or criminals. These were respectable, educated, productive members of society. Opium addiction in the Victorian era cut across all class lines. The difference was that wealthy addicts could afford private doctors and could hide their addiction behind closed doors. Poor addicts had no such luxury. And there was another layer of hypocrisy that needs to be mentioned: the Opium Wars. While England was grappling with domestic opium addiction, the British Empire was forcibly exporting opium to China. In the 1830s and 1840s, the British East India Company was growing opium in India and smuggling it into China, where it was illegal. When the Chinese government tried to stop the trade, Britain went to war to protect its opium profits, twice. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, and the Second Opium War, 1856-1860, resulted in British victories and forced China to legalise the opium trade and cede Hong Kong to Britain. The moral contradiction, condemning opium use at home while forcing it on China, was staggering. By the mid-19th century, it was becoming increasingly clear that opium, for all its benefits, was a dangerous substance. But the world was about to discover that opium's dangers were nothing compared to what was coming next. Chapter 4. The birth of modern chemistry. The age of alchemy was giving way to the age of chemistry. In the flickering gaslight of the early 19th century, a new kind of mind was beginning to ask a new kind of question. It wasn't enough to know that opium worked. Scientists wanted to know why. They wanted to dismantle the joy plant piece by piece and find the engine of its power. They wanted to isolate its soul. In a small, quiet town in Germany called Paderborn, a young pharmacist's apprentice was about to do just that. His name was Friedrich Serturner. He was barely into his 20s, working as an assistant in a pharmacy in Westphalia. He was not a celebrated professor or a wealthy industrialist. He was simply curious and possessed of a dangerous degree of persistence. Night after night, after the pharmacy had closed and the streets grew quiet, Serturner would work in his modest laboratory. He was obsessed with opium. He was convinced that the raw, sticky gum was a cocktail of different substances, and that one of them, one single active ingredient, was responsible for its profound effects. He called this hypothetical substance the principium somniferum, the sleep-inducing principle. His quest was to capture it. The work was painstaking, tedious, and fraught with risk. Using the crude tools of early chemistry, beakers, flasks, alcohol burners, he began a process of systematic chemical assault on raw opium. He dissolved the dark gum in acid, then neutralized it with ammonia. This caused a substance to precipitate out of the solution, forming tiny greyish-yellow crystals. He had isolated something, but what was it? He tested his new compound on stray dogs and mice. The results were dramatic. The animals would fall into a deep, profound sleep, a slumber so still it mimicked death. When they awoke, if they awoke, they seemed unharmed, though groggy and confused. This, Serturner believed, was it. This was the pure essence of opium's power. But to be certain, to truly prove its effect on humans, he needed human subjects. And so, in 1817, in an act of scientific bravery that bordered on madness, he recruited 3 of his friends, each of them a young man about his own age, and he made himself the first test subject. He carefully measured out a dose of the crystals for himself and his friends. It was a tiny amount, just half a grain, about 30 milligrams. They swallowed the bitter powder and waited. 30 minutes passed. Nothing. Serturner, feeling a mixture of disappointment and perhaps a little foolishness, decided to double the dose. He administered a full grain to each of them. This time, the effect was unmistakable. A warmth spread through their limbs, a leaden heaviness that was both pleasant and overpowering. Their heads grew thick, their thoughts slowed to a crawl. They felt as if they were floating, disconnected from their bodies. The room seemed to recede, sounds became distant and muffled. But Serturner wasn't satisfied. He wanted to push the boundaries of the substance to understand its full range of effects. He administered a 3rd dose, and this is where the experiment went terribly wrong. The effects became violent. Nausea set in, then vertigo, then a crushing headache. One of his friends collapsed into a stupor so deep he was unresponsive. His breathing became shallow and irregular. Serturner, realizing with horror that he had gone too far, that he was teetering on the very edge of poisoning his friends and himself, had to act quickly. He administered a powerful emetic, a dose of vinegar, to induce vomiting and purge their systems of the substance. They all survived, groggy and ill, but alive. The experiment was both a success and a terrifying warning. Serturner had found it. He had isolated the first active alkaloid ever to be extracted from a plant. He named his creation morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, a fitting tribute to the ancient power he had now tamed and concentrated. Later, the name would be standardized to morphine. The discovery was at first largely ignored. Serturner was an unknown from a provincial town, and the scientific establishment of the day was skeptical. But eventually, the implications of his work began to ripple through the scientific community. The French chemist Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac recognized the genius of the discovery and replicated Serturner's work. Soon, pharmaceutical companies like Merck in Germany began producing morphine commercially. The impact on medicine was revolutionary. For the first time, doctors had a painkiller of known and consistent purity. They could administer it with precision. A dose of morphine was the same in London as it was in Paris, or Vienna, or New York. It was 10 times more potent than raw opium, which meant smaller doses could achieve greater effects. It was a concentrated and reliable weapon against pain. It transformed surgery from an agonizing ordeal of butchery into a survivable procedure. Before morphine, surgeons had to operate as quickly as possible, while patients screamed and thrashed in agony, often held down by multiple assistants. With morphine, patients could be rendered unconscious, or at least insensible to pain. Complex procedures that had been impossible became routine. It gave relief to cancer patients, to sufferers of neuralgia, to anyone in the grip of extreme, unbearable pain. It seemed like a pure, unalloyed miracle. But this miracle had a dark twin. and a new piece of technology was about to unleash it on a scale the world had never seen. Part 2. The Soldier's Disease, Morphine's Dark Side. Chapter 5. The Hypodermic Needle. Revolution. In the 1850s, two physicians working independently made a discovery that would change the trajectory of medicine and addiction forever. In Scotland, Dr. Alexander Wood was experimenting with a new device for administering medications. In France, Dr. Charles Pravaz was working on a similar invention. Both men created what we now call the hypodermic syringe. The design was elegant in its simplicity, a hollow needle attached to a plunger mechanism. For the first time, a drug could be delivered directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the slow and inefficient route of the digestive system. When morphine was swallowed, it had to pass through the stomach, be absorbed by the intestines, processed by the liver, and only then reach the brain. This took time, 30 minutes to an hour, and much of the drug was metabolized before it could take effect. But when morphine was injected directly into a vein or into muscle tissue, it reached the brain within seconds or minutes. The effect was instantaneous and immensely powerful. Patients described a rush, a wave of warmth and euphoria that swept through their entire body. The pain didn't just diminish, it vanished, replaced by a sense of profound peace and well-being. The medical community embraced the hypodermic syringe with enthusiasm. It seemed to solve one of morphine's main limitations, the slow onset of effect. Doctors could now provide immediate relief to patients in acute pain. The syringe became a standard tool in every physician's bag, but there was a problem that no one anticipated, or if they did, they chose to ignore. The speed and intensity of the effect from injected morphine created a psychological association that was far more powerful than oral morphine ever had. The brain, receiving such a rapid and intense reward, began to crave it. The injection itself became ritualized, part of the addiction. The sight of the needle, the act of preparing the dose, the puncture of the skin, all of these became triggers for craving. Dr. Alexander Wood's own wife became one of the first documented cases of intravenous morphine addiction. She had been suffering from chronic pain, and Wood, believing he was helping her, administered regular injections of morphine. She became dependent, requiring ever-increasing doses. She eventually died, possibly from an overdose, though the exact circumstances are unclear. Wood was devastated, but by then the genie was out of the bottle. The marriage of pure morphine and the hypodermic needle was a turning point in history. It created a method of delivering relief and addiction that was faster, more intense, and more efficient than anything that had come before, and it arrived just in time for a war. Chapter 6. The American Civil War Epidemic. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, was a conflict of unprecedented industrial scale and brutality. It was the first modern war in many respects, the first to use railroads for troop movement, the first to use telegraph for communication, the first to employ rifled muskets and artillery on a massive scale. These technological advances made the war far deadlier than any previous conflict in American history. The weapons were new and terrible. The Minier ball, a conical soft-lead bullet, shattered bone and tore through flesh in a way that made amputation the most common surgical procedure. Unlike the round musket balls of the earlier wars, which tended to push tissue aside, the Minier ball tumbled and fragmented, creating massive wound cavities. A shot to the arm or leg often meant the limb had to be amputated to prevent infection and gangrene. The battlefields were scenes of unimaginable carnage. At Gettysburg alone, over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured in just 3 days. At Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, nearly 23,000 men were casualties. The field hospitals, if they could be called hospitals, were even worse. Overwhelmed surgeons worked in blood-soaked tents, with little understanding of sanitation and an endless line of screaming wounded men. Pain was the enemy, as much as the opposing army. And the Army's medical corps had two invaluable tools in its arsenal: chloroform for anesthesia during surgery, and morphine for the brutal, lingering pain that came after. Morphine was distributed on a massive scale. The Union Army alone purchased millions of opium pills and tens of thousands of ounces of morphine powder during the war. It was administered liberally, often by exhausted and undertrained medics who had little understanding of proper dosing or the risks of dependency. It was a blessing. It saved countless men from dying of shock and agony. It allowed them to endure the unendurable, the sawing off of a limb without adequate anaesthesia, the days and weeks of pain as wounds slowly healed or festered. But when the war ended in 1865 and the soldiers who survived returned home, they brought a new affliction with them. They were missing limbs, their bodies scarred, their minds haunted by what they had seen and done. And for many of them, there was another, more insidious wound, a deep gnawing craving for the medicine that had gotten them through the war. They had left the battlefield, but they could not leave behind the needle and the little bottle of morphine solution. The condition became so common it was given a name, the soldier's disease, or the army disease. It was the first modern epidemic of iatrogenic, physician-caused, addiction. Let me tell you about one soldier, a composite based on thousands of similar stories documented in medical journals and veterans' accounts. His name, for our purposes, is Sergeant James Miller. He served with the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment, the unit that famously held Little Round Top at Gettysburg. In the summer of 1863, during that battle, a Confederate Minia ball shattered his left femur. He was carried from the field, his leg a mangled ruin, bone fragments visible through torn flesh. The regimental surgeon, working by candlelight in a tent filled with the screams of the dying, administered a dose of chloroform and amputated Miller's leg above the knee. When Miller awoke, the agony was indescribable. The surgeon gave him morphine, injected directly into his arm with one of the new hypodermic syringes. The relief was immediate and absolute. For the first time in days, Miller could breathe without screaming. Over the following weeks, as he recovered in a hospital in Washington, D.C., Miller received morphine regularly, 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day. By the time he was discharged in late 1863, he had been using morphine continuously for months. His body had adapted to the drug. His brain chemistry had been altered. He needed morphine now, not just for pain, but to feel normal, to avoid the crushing sickness of withdrawal. Miller returned to his home in Maine, a hero, missing a leg but alive. But he was not whole. He obtained morphine from a local doctor, claiming phantom limb pain, which was real. But his need for the drug went beyond pain, relief. He was addicted. Over the next few years, his life slowly unravelled. He lost his job. His wife left him, taking their children. By 1872, less than a decade after the war ended, James Miller was found dead in a boarding house in Portland, a syringe and an empty morphine vial beside him. He was 34 years old. Miller's story was repeated thousands of times across the United States in the decades after the Civil War. Estimates vary, but historians believe that somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 Civil War veterans returned home addicted to morphine. These men, once celebrated as heroes, were now often seen as moral failures. Their morphinism was seen as a private shame, a character flaw rather than a medical condition. There was no infrastructure to help them. The Veterans Administration didn't exist yet. There were no addiction treatment centres, no methadone clinics, no understanding of addiction as a chronic disease. The medical community's response was essentially to blame the addicts and wash their hands of responsibility. The soldier's disease was the first generation to discover the terrible paradox of Sir Turner's creation. The cure for pain could create a suffering all its own, a prison with walls made of pure relief. Chapter 7: Victorian Women's Hidden Epidemic. But it wasn't just soldiers. While the soldier's disease received public attention, in part because it affected visible male veterans, a much larger and more hidden epidemic was unfolding in middle-class homes across America and Europe. Victorian women were being prescribed morphine at rates that would shock modern observers. The reason was simple. Victorian medicine had an explanation for almost any ailment a woman might suffer, and that explanation almost always involved the uterus or female hysteria. Menstrual cramps, morphine, anxiety, morphine, depression, morphine, postpartum pain, morphine, menopause symptoms, morphine. The list went on and on. Doctors believed that women were inherently more fragile than men, more prone to nervous disorders, more susceptible to pain, and so they prescribed morphine liberally, often in the form of laudanum or as injections. The hypodermic syringe, marketed in Sears catalogues and available through mail order, made it easy for women to self-administer at home. The result was a hidden epidemic. By some estimates, by the 1890s, 2/3 of morphine addicts in the United States were women, but their addiction was invisible. They weren't on the streets, they weren't in prison, they were in their homes, behind closed doors, taking their medicine in private. One example, and this one is historical, not composite, is the poet Emily Dickinson. While Dickinson's reclusive lifestyle is often attributed to agoraphobia or social anxiety, recent scholarship has suggested that she may have been dependent on laudanum. Her poems contain numerous references to opium-like states, to darkness and light, to pain and relief. Her doctor's records, where they survive, show prescriptions for laudanum for various ailments. Whether she was addicted in the clinical sense is impossible to say with certainty, but the pattern is suggestive. What's clear is that thousands of Victorian women found themselves trapped in the same cycle as the Civil War veterans. They had been prescribed morphine by trusted physicians, they had taken it as directed, and they had become dependent. But because their addiction happened in private, because it was medicalised and prescribed, it wasn't seen as addiction at all. It was just taking medicine. The medical profession was complicit in creating this epidemic, but they refused to acknowledge responsibility. When women came to doctors complaining of symptoms of withdrawal, anxiety, insomnia, muscle pain, doctors often prescribed more morphine, perpetuating the cycle. The term morphinism emerged in medical literature in the 1870s and 1880s, but it was rarely applied to respectable middle-class patients. Instead, doctors euphemistically referred to overuse or dependence or habitual use. The moral stigma was reserved for working-class addicts and racial minorities who were seen as weak or degenerate. By the 1890s, it was becoming undeniable that morphine, for all its medical benefits, had created a social catastrophe. The search was on for a solution. The world needed a painkiller with all the power of morphine, but without its dreadful curse of addiction. Medicine had solved one problem, the wild, unpredictable nature of opium, only to create a new and more terrifying one. But the pharmaceutical industry believed it could do better. In the gleaming, state-of-the-art laboratories of a rising German chemical giant, a team of scientists believed they were on the verge of creating the perfect drug. They were looking for a hero, and they would find one. Or so they thought. Part 3. Bayer's Betrayal. The Birth of Heroin. Chapter 8. The Search for a Safer Morphine. The setting for our next scene is not an ancient field or a makeshift war hospital, but a place of gleaming modernity and industrial ambition. It is Elberfeld, Germany, in the last years of the 19th century. And the protagonist is not a single man, but a corporation, Friedrich Bayer and Company. Bayer was a titan of industry, a chemical powerhouse that had built its fortune not on medicine, but on colour. They were masters of synthetic dyes, pulling brilliant blues and vibrant reds from the black sticky waste of coal tar. Their success was built on rigorous research, a deep faith in chemistry, and a keen sense of the market. Having conquered the world of textiles, they turned their formidable research and development apparatus toward a new, even more lucrative frontier, pharmaceuticals. By the 1890s, the problem of morphine addiction was impossible to ignore. Medical journals were filled with case studies of morphinism. Sanatoriums, dedicated to treating morphine addicts, were opening across Europe and America. The public was beginning to lose faith in doctors who seemed to be creating as many problems as they solved. At the same time, there was a desperate need for effective respiratory medicines. Tuberculosis, bronchitis, and pneumonia were rampant killers. In an era before antibiotics, respiratory diseases were the leading cause of death in industrialized nations. The primary symptom of all these diseases was a deep, racking, persistent cough, a cough that exhausted patients, prevented sleep, and hastened decline. The best available cough suppressant was codeine, another alkaloid found in opium. Codeine was milder than morphine and was thought to be less addictive, but its weakness was its defining trait. It often wasn't strong enough to quell the violent coughing fits associated with serious lung disease. Morphine, on the other hand, was an excellent cough suppressant. It worked by depressing the cough center in the brainstem, essentially turning off the body's cough reflex. But it had a terrible side effect. It also depressed the respiratory center right next to it. In weak, frail patients who needed cough suppression most, tuberculosis patients, pneumonia patients, a dose of morphine strong enough to stop their cough could also be strong enough to stop their breathing altogether. And then, of course, there was the addiction. This was the challenge that Professor Heinrich Drieser set for his team at Bayer's Pharmaceutical division. Drieser was the head of Bayer's pharmacology laboratory, a confident and ambitious man who believed deeply in the power of chemistry to improve upon nature. He wanted a new drug, a drug with the cough-suppressing power of morphine, but without its dangerous tendency to shut down the lungs. And most importantly, he wanted a drug that was not addictive. He believed it was possible to chemically separate the good effects of morphine from the bad. He wanted to create a safe morphine, a better morphine. He wanted to create a hero. Chapter 9. Felix Hoffmann's Personal Crusade. The task of synthesizing this new wonder drug fell to a young chemist in Drieser's laboratory named Felix Hoffmann. Hoffmann was a talented and methodical chemist, the very same man who, just 11 days earlier, had successfully synthesized the stable, marketable form of aspirin, acetyl salicylic acid, from salicylic acid derived from willow bark. He was on a roll. He was Bayer's golden boy. But Hoffmann's motivation went beyond professional ambition. His father was suffering from chronic debilitating rheumatoid arthritis. The pain was excruciating, and the only medication that provided relief was morphine. But Hoffmann's father had become dependent on the drug. He needed it constantly. He suffered when he didn't have it. Felix Hoffmann, watching his father's decline, was determined to find a better solution, not just for the world, but for his own family. His method was the same one he'd used to create aspirin, acetylation. It was a standard chemical technique, attaching an acetyl group, a small molecular fragment consisting of a carbon atom double bonded to an oxygen atom and single bonded to a methyl group, to a molecule to change its properties. Hoffmann had done it with salicylic acid to create aspirin, making it less harsh on the stomach while preserving its pain-relieving effects. Now he would try the same thing with morphine. On August 21, 1897, in Bayer's laboratories in Elberfeld, Hoffmann took pure morphine, derived from Bayer's vast supplies of opium, and boiled it with a chemical called acetic anhydride. It was a straightforward if noxious process. The acetic anhydride was corrosive and smelled terrible, like vinegar mixed with chemicals. But after several hours of heating and stirring, Hoffmann had produced a new compound. The result was a fine white crystalline powder. The chemical name was diacetyl morphine. 2 acetyl groups had been attached to the morphine molecule. Hoffmann had done his job. He had created the substance. Now it was up to Heinrich Drieser to figure out what it could do. But here's the tragedy. Hoffmann's father never recovered. There's no record of him being cured of his morphine addiction by his son's new invention. Most likely he died still dependent on morphine, his condition untouched by the chemical that was supposed to save him. Chapter 10. Heinrich Drieser's Fatal Miscalculation. Drieser began testing the new compound immediately. He started with animals, mice, guinea pigs, and rabbits. The results were immediately encouraging. The substance was a remarkably powerful respiratory suppressant. It calmed the breathing of the animals far more effectively than codeine. Crucially, in the doses he was testing, it did not seem to cause the dangerous level of respiratory depression that morphine did. At first glance, it appeared to be safer. The next step was human trials. These were not the rigorous double-blind, placebo-controlled studies we would expect today. There was no ethics committee, no informed consent process, no long-term follow-up. Drieser and his team began by testing the drug on themselves and their laboratory assistants. Then they expanded to workers in the Bayer factory who were suffering from coughs. The reports were glowing. The substance was astonishingly effective. A very small dose, just 5 milligrams, could stop a persistent cough in its tracks, allowing for a peaceful night's sleep. But there was another effect, a side effect that was noted with great interest. The subjects reported feeling a pleasant euphoria. It made them feel good. They felt strong, clear-headed, and full of energy. One report noted that the drug produced a sense of heroism. This observation lit a fire in Drieser's marketing-savvy mind. He saw the name. This was a heroic drug, one that would conquer disease and suffering. He officially named the substance Heroin, from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic or strong. The name evoked strength, health, triumph over illness. It sounded modern and scientific. It sounded like a solution. But Drieser didn't just see heroin as a cough suppressant. He saw a much grander, more audacious application. Based on his flawed and limited observations, Drieser became convinced that heroin was not addictive. In fact, he theorized that it could be the cure for morphine addiction. His reasoning was a tragic leap of faith. He believed that heroin satisfied the physical craving for an opiate without producing the same soporific, stupefying effects of morphine. He imagined that a morphine addict could be switched to heroin, and then, because heroin was supposedly non-addictive, they could simply be weaned off it with little to no discomfort. He had found the Holy Grail, a non-addictive morphine substitute that could also cure morphine addiction. It was the perfect product. What Drieser didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood with the limited biochemical knowledge of 1897, was that heroin was not a fundamentally different substance from morphine. It was a delivery system. The two acetyl groups that Hoffman had attached to the morphine molecule made it more fat-soluble. This allowed heroin to cross the blood-brain barrier much faster than morphine. Once inside the brain, enzymes quickly stripped away those acetyl groups, converting heroin back into morphine. The user wasn't experiencing a new, non-addictive substance. They were experiencing a supercharged dose of morphine, delivered directly to the brain's opioid receptors with a speed and intensity that morphine alone couldn't match. This rapid onset was the key to both heroin's perceived effectiveness and its devastatingly addictive power. It created a cycle of reinforcement that was far more potent than morphine's slower action. But Drieser didn't know this. In November 1898, he presented his findings to the Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians, one of the most prestigious medical conferences in Europe. He extolled the virtues of his new discovery. He declared it to be 10 times more effective as a cough suppressant than codeine, but with only a fraction of the side effects of morphine. He positioned it as a wonder drug, a testament to the power of German science and Bayer's industrial prowess. The medical community was captivated. If what Drieser said was true, this was indeed a revolutionary breakthrough. Here finally was the safe opiate that medicine had been searching for. Chapter 11, The Global Marketing Blitz, continued. Advertisements bloomed in the pages of the world's most respected medical journals. One striking advertisement from the era shows the name heroin in bold Art Nouveau lettering. Surrounded by a litany of ailments it promised to vanquish: coughs, bronchitis, phthisis, tuberculosis, asthma, whooping cough. Another, featuring the Bayer logo prominently, simply stated, "Heroin, the sedative for coughs." The company presented it not as a narcotic, but as a specific therapeutic agent, a tool of precision medicine. It didn't just mask a cough, it cured the irritation that caused it. It didn't just dull pain, it provided relief without the stupor of morphine. Most astonishingly, and with an irony so profound it would become the stuff of medical tragedy, Bayer marketed heroin as a cure for addiction itself. It was promoted as a non-addictive substance that could be used to wean patients off their dependence on morphine or codeine. Doctors, desperate for a solution to the growing problem of iatrogenic opioid addiction, a problem created by the widespread use of medicines from the previous generation, embraced this claim with desperate relief. Here at last was the exit ramp, a way to treat pain and suffering without creating a new prison for the patient. And so heroin entered the public sphere not through the back alleys, but through the front door of the pharmacy. It was sold over the counter without a prescription in nearly every country it reached. A person suffering from a cold could walk into a chemist's shop in Paris and purchase a bottle of heroin hydrochloride as easily as they could buy soap. A mother in rural America could order a Bayer heroin-based cough syrup for her child through a mail-order catalogue like Sears, Roebuck and Company. The St. James Society, a philanthropic organisation in New York, went even further. Believing they were performing a public service, they mounted a campaign to mail free samples of heroin to morphine addicts who had written to them seeking help. The logic was simple and, in hindsight, horrifyingly misguided. Heroin could cure morphine addiction, so giving it away for free to morphine addicts was an act of charity. Thousands of packages were mailed out, each containing heroin powder and instructions on how to use it. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. It was just another proprietary medicine, another weapon in the household arsenal against everyday illness. It sat in medicine cabinets next to the iodine and the aspirin, another Bayer product that Hoffman had synthesized just days before heroin. A small, unassuming bottle containing a substance of almost unimaginable power. Its heroic name was a testament to the world's boundless faith in a better life through chemistry. The marketing materials were aggressive and comprehensive. Bayer distributed thousands of promotional items, calendars featuring the heroin name, pamphlets describing its uses, testimonials from satisfied doctors. Medical conventions featured Bayer representatives demonstrating the drug's effectiveness. The company spared no expense. This was to be their flagship product, the crown jewel of their pharmaceutical division. For a few short, heady years, it seemed that Bayer had truly delivered a cure for the world's cough, a balm for its pain, and a solution to its addictions. The little white powder was everywhere, a quiet, ubiquitous presence promising relief in every bottle. Production ramped up dramatically. By 1899, Bayer was producing approximately 1 ton of heroin per year. By 1902, that figure had increased substantially as demand continued to grow. The drug was prescribed for an astonishing range of conditions beyond respiratory ailments: pain relief during childbirth, post-surgical recovery, menstrual cramps, insomnia, depression, anxiety, even irritability in children. One medical journal from 1900 recommended heroin for senile conditions, essentially as a treatment for the general discomforts of aging. The world, it seemed, had found its hero. The medical profession had its wonder drug, Bayer had its blockbuster product, and Felix Hoffmann, the young chemist who had synthesized it, was celebrated as one of the great pharmaceutical innovators of his generation, alongside his creation of aspirin. But beneath this triumphant surface, something else was happening. Something that would not be fully understood for years. The trap had been set, and millions were walking into it, one dose at a time. The pharmaceutical industry had created what it believed was a miracle. What it had actually created was a time bomb. The deception, born of a mixture of wishful thinking, flawed science, inadequate testing, and commercial ambition, was complete. The world, desperate for a miracle, was ready to believe, and so the trap was set. Bayer began producing heroin by the ton, shipping its little bottles of white powder to every corner of the globe, from London to Shanghai, from New York to Buenos Aires, from Vienna to Cairo. They were unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, that they were not curing an epidemic but preparing to unleash a plague that would span generations and continents. The heroic cure, having seduced the world with its promise, was about to reveal its true nature. The age of illegal heroin had begun, and it would take nearly 2 decades for the world to realize the magnitude of the mistake that had been made. Part 4. The Great Unraveling. Addiction Revealed. Chapter 12. The First Warnings. The first threads of the Great Deception began to unravel not in grand pronouncements from prestigious medical bodies, but in the quiet, worried correspondence of ordinary doctors. They began as whispers, as scattered anecdotes from the front lines of medicine. In 1899, barely a year after heroin's commercial launch, a physician in Philadelphia wrote a short letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association. He noted with a tone of clinical curiosity that several of his tuberculosis patients, whom he had placed on heroin to control their coughs, seemed to require ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effect. More troublingly, when they attempted to cease the medication, they were afflicted with what he described as a peculiar and severe form of uneasiness. A pharmacist in Boston noticed that certain customers were returning for Bayer's cough elixir with alarming frequency. Their colds apparently lasted for months on end. They were pale, thin, and visibly agitated if he happened to be out of stock. Some became belligerent, even threatening, when told they would need to wait for a new shipment. In France, doctors treating morphine addicts with Bayer's new cure observed a disturbing phenomenon. Their patients did indeed stop using morphine, but they simply transferred their devotion to heroin with a ferocity that was startling. They called this new state heroinism, and it appeared to be a far more ravenous and intractable condition than the morphine addiction it was meant to replace. These were the early signals, the first tremors before the earthquake. For a time, they were dismissed. Bayer, when confronted with these reports, confidently assured the medical community that these were isolated cases, likely due to improper administration or the psychological disposition of the patients themselves. The drug, they insisted, was non-habituating. Their research was conclusive, and for a while, the world believed them. The drug was simply too effective, the relief it provided too profound, for doctors to abandon it based on a few scattered reports. The alternative was to go back to the weaker codeine or the dreaded morphine. Heroin seemed like progress, and progress, once begun, is difficult to stop. But the threads kept unravelling, and soon the whispers grew into a chorus of alarm. By 1902, physicians were reporting cases not just of increased tolerance, but of full-blown addiction. Patients who had been prescribed heroin for a simple cough were now unable to function without it. They were experiencing withdrawal symptoms, sweating, shaking, vomiting when they tried to stop. They were sneaking back to multiple doctors to obtain additional prescriptions. Some were resorting to theft to pay for their habit. A report from a New York City hospital in 1903 documented the case of a young woman, a schoolteacher, who had been prescribed heroin for a persistent cough following a bout of bronchitis. Within 6 months, she was using heroin not for her cough, which had long since resolved, but simply to avoid the crushing sickness she felt when she didn't use it. She had lost her job. Her family had disowned her. She was admitted to the hospital in a state of severe malnutrition and depression. The doctors treating her were baffled. This was supposed to be the non-addictive alternative to morphine. The medical literature began to fill with similar case studies. A sailor who had been given heroin for pain after an injury and was now unable to work because of his dependence. A wealthy businessman's wife who had been prescribed heroin for female complaints and was now secretly visiting multiple doctors to maintain her supply. A veteran who had switched from morphine to heroin on his doctor's recommendation, only to find himself in an even deeper pit of addiction. Chapter 13. The Biochemical Truth. The central, catastrophic flaw in Bayer's miracle drug was a simple matter of biochemistry, one that had been tragically overlooked in their initial research, or perhaps one they had chosen not to investigate too deeply. Diacetyl morphine, heroin, was not, as Dreiser had believed, a fundamentally different substance from morphine. It was in essence a delivery system. The two acetyl groups that Felix Hoffmann had attached to the morphine molecule made it significantly more lipophilic, more fat-soluble. This simple chemical modification had profound implications. The blood-brain barrier, the protective membrane that surrounds the brain, is designed to keep most chemicals in the bloodstream from entering brain tissue. It's a critical defense mechanism, but fat-soluble molecules can cross this barrier much more easily than water-soluble ones. And heroin, with its acetyl groups, was far more fat-soluble than morphine. When heroin was injected, smoked, or even taken orally, it raced to the brain with remarkable speed. Once inside the brain, enzymes quickly went to work stripping away those acetyl groups, converting the compound back into morphine, the same morphine that Sir Turner had isolated a century earlier, the same morphine that had created hundreds of thousands of addicts after the Civil War. The user was not experiencing a new, non-addictive substance. They were experiencing a supercharged dose of morphine, delivered directly to the brain's opioid receptors with a speed and intensity that morphine alone couldn't match. The heroin molecule was essentially a Trojan horse, sneaking morphine past the brain's defences. This rapid onset of effects was the key to both heroin's perceived effectiveness and its devastatingly addictive power. When morphine was taken orally, it took 30 to 60 minutes to reach peak effect. When heroin was injected, users felt effects within seconds. This created a powerful psychological association. The brain, receiving such a rapid and intense reward, began to crave not just the chemical, but the entire ritual, the preparation, the injection, the immediate rush. Scientists would later discover that this rapid delivery created changes in the brain's reward circuitry that were far more profound than those created by slower-acting opioids. The faster a drug reaches the brain, the more addictive it tends to be. Heroin's speed was its weapon. The concept of tolerance began to fill the pages of medical literature. Doctors described how a patient who once found relief from a single 5 mg tablet of heroin now required 10 mg, then 20, then 50, then 100 or more. The cough was long gone, but the need for the medicine remained, transformed from a medical necessity into a gnawing physical imperative, and with tolerance came the true horror, withdrawal. The uneasiness described in those early letters was given a more detailed and terrifying vocabulary, as doctors witnessed the full syndrome. It was a complete systemic collapse. Withdrawal typically began 6 to 12 hours after the last dose. First came the anxiety, a creeping sense of dread and discomfort. Then the yawning, uncontrollable jaw-cracking yawns. Eyes and nose began to stream with tears and mucus. Profuse sweating followed, then chills and gooseflesh, a symptom that gave rise to the chillingly descriptive slang term cold turkey, because the skin of a person in withdrawal supposedly resembled that of a plucked turkey. Then came the muscle cramps, violent, painful spasms in the legs and back, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, insomnia that could last for days, and overarching all of this physical agony was an overwhelming psychological despair, a sense that life itself was unbearable, that death would be preferable to this suffering. Doctors chronicled these symptoms with a kind of horrified detachment. It was the agony of morphine withdrawal, but many physicians reported that it was faster in onset and subjectively at least far more severe. The body, deprived of the substance it had been rewired to expect, was screaming in every possible way. The deception was now laid bare. The heroic cure for morphine addiction was not only addictive itself, it was, by most clinical measures, approximately 2 to 3 times more potent in creating dependency and significantly harder to break free from. The free samples that Bayer had so generously distributed, the thousands of bottles sold over pharmacy counters, the prescriptions written by well-meaning physicians, all had acted as a vast, uncontrolled clinical trial, and the results were pouring in, damning and undeniable. Chapter 14. The medical community retreats. Sanatoriums and asylums, once filled primarily with alcoholics and morphine addicts, began to report a new class of patient, the heroin habitué, and these were not at first shadowy figures from the underworld. They were teachers, clerks, housewives and labourers, ordinary people who had been prescribed a cough suppressant and had walked into a chemical trap from which there was no easy escape. The very doctors who had championed the drug, who had prescribed it liberally and praised its effectiveness, were now faced with the monumental task of undoing the damage they had unwittingly caused. The medicine cabinet, once a source of comfort and relief, had for thousands become a cage. By 1905, the American Medical Association had seen enough. They removed heroin from their list of accepted medicines, striking its name from new and non-official remedies, their official compendium of approved drugs. The medical community, once the drug's greatest advocate, was beginning to turn its back on the fallen hero. Medical journals that had once published glowing reports about heroin now published warnings. The British Medical Journal noted in 1906 that the habit of heroin use is readily formed and is very difficult to cure. The Journal of the American Medical Association published an editorial in 1912 stating bluntly, heroin habituation should be treated as a vice rather than as a method of treatment. International medical conferences began to discuss the heroin problem. At a meeting in Berlin in 1910, German physicians who had initially championed heroin stood up and publicly recanted their earlier enthusiasm. They admitted they had been wrong. They admitted that heroin was creating addiction on a scale they had never anticipated. Bayer, facing mounting criticism and liability concerns, quietly began to wind down heroin production. By 1913, they had ceased manufacturing it entirely, though they never issued a public apology, never acknowledged the full extent of the harm they had caused, never offered compensation to the hundreds of thousands of people whose lives had been destroyed by their miracle cure. The company's official history, published decades later, would barely mention heroin at all, treating it as a minor footnote to their triumphs with aspirin and other pharmaceuticals. Felix Hoffmann, the chemist who synthesized both aspirin and heroin, would be celebrated for the former and rarely mentioned in connection with the latter. The deception had unravelled completely, leaving behind a trail of broken dependencies, shattered families, and a problem that was about to spill out of the clinics and hospitals and onto the streets of every major city in the industrialized world. Part 5. Prohibition and the Black Market Birth. Chapter 15. The Harrison Act and Unintended Consequences. By the early 1910s, the United States was facing a full-blown drug crisis. Estimates varied, but most medical authorities believed there were between 200,000 and 300,000 heroin addicts in the country, alongside hundreds of thousands more who were addicted to morphine or cocaine. This was in a nation of approximately 90 million people. The per capita addiction rate was staggering. The progressive era was in full swing, a period of great social reform, but also of great social anxiety. Americans were fearful of rapid industrialization, of the teeming immigrant neighbourhoods in cities like New York and Chicago, of changing social mores, of anything that threatened the traditional order. And drug addiction, particularly among immigrants and racial minorities, became a focal point for this anxiety. Newspapers began printing lurid headlines about dope fiends and drug-crazed criminals. Stories circulated, many of them completely fabricated, about Chinese opium dens where white women were supposedly lured and corrupted, about black cocaine users who supposedly gained superhuman strength and became impervious to bullets, about Mexican immigrants spreading marijuana use. The racism underlying these narratives was barely disguised. Heroin was linked in the public imagination with vice, crime, and foreignness. It was no longer a German miracle cure. It was an insidious poison corrupting America's youth and undermining its moral fibre. The addict, once seen as a patient, an unfortunate victim to be pitied and treated, was now recast as a dope fiend, a dangerous, morally weak deviant to be feared and punished. This moral panic created the perfect political climate for federal action. For decades, narcotics regulation had been a patchwork of inconsistent state and local laws. But now a powerful movement for federal control was gaining momentum, driven by a coalition of reformers, diplomats, temperance advocates, and law enforcement officials. A key figure in this push was Dr. Hamilton Wright, appointed as the United States' first opium commissioner. Wright was a zealous and ambitious physician who saw narcotics addiction not primarily as a medical issue, but as a moral and international one. He believed that America's domestic drug problem was a national disgrace that undermined the country's standing on the world stage, and he lobbied tirelessly for a federal law that would bring the narcotics trade under strict government control. Wright's efforts, combined with international pressure from conferences at Shanghai, 1909, and The Hague, 1912, paved the way for landmark legislation. The result was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, passed by Congress in December 1914 and signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. On its surface, the Harrison Act was not a prohibition law. It was framed as a tax law, using the federal government's constitutional power to levy taxes. It required any person who imported, manufactured, sold, or distributed cocaine or opium-derived products, including heroin, morphine, and codeine, to register with the federal government, pay a special tax, and use specific government-issued order forms to track transactions. Physicians were permitted to prescribe these drugs, but only in the course of his professional practice only. And within that seemingly innocuous phrase lay a revolution. The crucial question became, what constituted legitimate professional practice? The law did not specify. The power of interpretation fell to the enforcers, specifically the Bureau of Internal Revenue within the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department, staffed by law enforcement officers rather than doctors, adopted a hardline, punitive interpretation. They quickly decided that prescribing narcotics to an addict simply to maintain their habit, what would later be called maintenance prescribing, was not a legitimate medical practice. It was merely catering to a vice. The consequences of this interpretation were immediate and catastrophic. Doctors who had been humanely maintaining their addicted patients on steady, legal doses of heroin or morphine suddenly found themselves in legal jeopardy. Treasury agents began conducting raids on doctors' offices, seizing prescription records, and making arrests. A series of Supreme Court decisions in the years following the Harrison Act, United States v. Doremus, 1919, Webb v. United States, 1919, and United States v. Berman, 1922, solidified the government's position, effectively criminalizing the medical treatment of addiction. The court ruled that prescribing narcotics merely to keep an addict comfortable was not legitimate medical treatment under the Harrison Act. Between 1919 and 1935, approximately 25,000 physicians were arrested or harassed for violating the Harrison Act. Many had their medical licenses revoked. Some went to prison. The message was clear: treat addicts at your own peril. One notable case was that of Dr. Charles Linder, a physician in Spokane, Washington. In 1925, Dr. Linder prescribed morphine to a patient who was, unknown to him, working as an informant for federal agents. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of violating the Harrison Act. His case eventually reached the Supreme Court, which ruled in his favour in Linder v. United States, 1925, stating that doctors should be allowed to prescribe narcotics to addicts in the course of legitimate medical treatment. But by then, Dr. Linder's reputation was destroyed, his practice ruined, and his health broken. He died shortly after his legal vindication. Fearing for their licenses and their liberty, the vast majority of American doctors simply stopped treating addicts altogether. They closed their doors to the very patients who needed them most. Some did so reluctantly, with genuine regret. Others did so with relief, happy to be rid of patients they had come to see as troublesome and ungrateful. This single piece of legislation, born of a mixture of good intentions, moral panic, racial prejudice, and political opportunism, fundamentally altered the landscape of addiction in America. It did not end heroin use, it merely ended its legal supply. The problem was wrenched from the hands of the medical community and thrown into the arms of the criminal justice system. Medicine's failure had become law enforcement's burden, and the addicts, the patients, were caught in the middle. Chapter 16. From medicine cabinet to back alley. With doctors out of the picture, the thousands of users who had been dependent on a legal, regulated supply were now desperate. They were sick, in withdrawal, and suddenly branded as criminals. Their medicine was now contraband. Their only recourse was the street, and the street was ready. The transformation was swift and brutal. Within a few years of the Harrison Act's passage, heroin had completed its metamorphosis from medicine to menace, from pharmacy to black market. The user base began to change dramatically. The middle-class patient with a persistent cough was replaced by a different demographic. Disillusioned soldiers returning from World War I, labourers in sprawling industrial cities, petty criminals, prostitutes, and the denizens of urban vice districts. These were people living on the margins, for whom the drug's potent euphoric oblivion was not a side effect to be managed, but its primary appeal. The method of consumption also evolved. The era of the sweet medicinal elixir was over. The new users bought heroin powder, which was now being manufactured in clandestine labs, or diverted from dwindling legitimate pharmaceutical stocks. They discovered that its effects were far more potent if it wasn't swallowed, but sniffed, inhaled through the nose, allowing the drug to be absorbed through the mucous membranes directly into the bloodstream. Sniffing parties became a feature of the bohemian and jazz underworld scenes in cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans in the 1920s. Artists, musicians, and intellectuals experimented with heroin in the same way they experimented with alcohol during Prohibition, as a form of rebellion against puritanical social norms. But soon after, an even more efficient and dangerous method was popularized: injection. The hypodermic syringe, once a medical innovation, became the tool that sealed heroin's reputation as a street drug. Injection allowed for the most direct and powerful administration, producing an intense rush that sniffing or smoking couldn't match. But it also brought with it new horrors: abscesses, infections, collapsed veins, and the easy transmission of diseases like hepatitis, and, decades later, HIV/AIDS. Heroin was no longer a medicine. It was a jolt, a fix, a shot. Its identity was being forged anew in the shadows of American cities. The price of heroin on the illicit market skyrocketed. What had once cost a few cents for a therapeutic dose now cost dollars, serious money in the 1920s and 1930s, and the purity became dangerously unpredictable. Street dealers, looking to maximize profits, cut heroin with all manner of adulterants: quinine, sugar, starch, talcum powder, even strychnine. A dose that was 50% pure one day might be 5% pure the next, or 90% pure, creating a deadly game of Russian roulette. Users, in order to pay the inflated prices for their now illegal medicine, were often driven to theft, burglary, prostitution, and other criminal activities. The law had not solved the problem of heroin addiction. It had transformed a public health crisis into a crime wave. The stereotype of the junkie, desperate, dishonest, dangerous, was born in this era. And once that stereotype was established, it became nearly impossible to see addicts as anything other than criminals who deserved punishment rather than treatment. The little bottle that had once sat in the medicine cabinet next to the aspirin was now gone. In its place stood the police officer, the jail cell, and the shadowy figure dealing mystery powder in a back alley. The heroic cure, having deceived the world, was now officially a menace. banished to the very shadows it would help to define for the next century. Chapter 17. The Mafia sees an opportunity. The law, in its infinite and often misguided wisdom, had slammed the door shut on legal heroin. The Harrison Act, the various state and local bans, the international conventions, they had declared the age of pharmaceutical heroin over. But in the grand, drafty house of global commerce, another door, a back door, had just creaked open. A much more profitable one. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the vacuum left by Bayer, by Merck, by the legions of physicians who had once prescribed heroin was vast, deep, and begging to be filled. Into this void stepped men who understood supply and demand better than any economist. Men who wore fedoras instead of lab coats, who measured profit not in quarterly reports but in kilos and body counts. The modern heroin trade, the one that would stain the rest of the 20th century, was about to be born. Prohibition, enacted in 1920s, had created a template for organised crime. The Italian-American mafia, which had previously been involved primarily in extortion, gambling and labour racketeering, discovered that smuggling illegal alcohol was extraordinarily profitable. They built sophisticated smuggling networks, corrupted law enforcement and politicians, and established distribution systems that reached every major city. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the mafia didn't disappear. They simply switched products, and they recognised that heroin was potentially even more lucrative than alcohol had been. An alcoholic might drink a bottle of whiskey. A heroin addict needed a fix every day, sometimes multiple times a day. The demand was constant, desperate, and inelastic. Users would pay almost any price to avoid withdrawal. The key figures in this new enterprise were men whose names would become synonymous with organised crime: Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and later Vito Genovese. These men controlled the ports, particularly in New York City. They controlled the longshoremen's unions, which meant they controlled what came in and out of the country's busiest harbour. They controlled political machines through bribes and intimidation. They had the infrastructure for smuggling on an industrial scale, but they needed a supply source. American pharmaceutical companies had stopped producing heroin. Domestic sources had dried up. The mafia needed international partners, and they found them in unlikely places, first in Sicily, Luciano's homeland, where small labs began producing heroin from morphine base, and then, more significantly, in France, specifically in the port city of Marseille. The foundation for one of the most efficient criminal enterprises in history was being laid. The French Connection was about to begin. Part 6. The French Connection, Heroin's Golden Age. Chapter 18. From Turkish fields to Marseille labs, the story of the French. Connection begins not in France, but in Turkey, specifically in the Anatolian Plateau, the highland region of central Turkey, where the climate and soil are ideal for growing Papaver somniferum. For centuries, Turkish farmers had cultivated poppies, harvesting the latex and selling raw opium to pharmaceutical companies. Much of this production was entirely legal. Turkey was one of the world's largest suppliers of medical morphine, providing raw opium to legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturers who would process it into morphine for hospitals worldwide. The Turkish government licensed and regulated this trade, but inevitably there was surplus. Not every farmer sold exclusively through official channels, and there were always buyers willing to pay cash for opium or partially refined morphine base, no questions asked. This grey market opium found its way into the hands of smugglers, who transported it westward, to Lebanon, to Syria, and ultimately to France. The journey ended in Marseille, France's oldest city and its busiest Mediterranean port. Marseille had been a hub of international trade for millennia. In the aftermath of World War II, it was also home to a powerful criminal organisation, the Corsican syndicates, known collectively as the Milieu. The Corsicans were not flashy gangsters in the American style. They were clannish, secretive, and brutally efficient. They were dynasties of smugglers who had cut their teeth running contraband cigarettes and black market liquor. Men with names like Paul Carbone, François Spirito, and later Auguste Ricoeur. They knew the shipping lanes, the customs officials who could be bought, the quiet coves where a boat could unload cargo in the dead of night without being observed. When they saw the potential in heroin, a product lighter than liquor, more valuable than gold, with endless American demand, they moved decisively. The Corsicans built clandestine laboratories, not in Marseille itself, but tucked away in the sleepy villas and farmhouses of Provence, in the rocky hills overlooking the azure Mediterranean Sea. Here they employed the true wizards of this new trade, the chemists. Some were renegades, rogue talents, who had worked for legitimate pharmaceutical companies, but had been lured away by the extraordinary pay the Corsicans offered. They were men who knew the delicate dance of acetic anhydride and morphine base, who could perform the chemical acetylation that transformed morphine into diacetylmorphine, heroin. They were artists of a dark science. They took the crude brown blocks of morphine base from Turkey and, through a precise and dangerous multi-step process, purified them. They washed, filtered, boiled, and cooled until they had precipitated a substance of extraordinary quality. It was not the beige or brown powder that would later become common on American streets when quality declined. This was heroin number 4, pharmaceutical-grade diacetylmorphine, fluffy, brilliant white, and often testing at 98% purity. It was chemically speaking identical to what Bayer had produced in its Elberfeld laboratories decades earlier. It was the best heroin in the world, and it would become known simply by the name of its source, the French Connection. Chapter 19. Lucky Luciano's Atlantic Pipeline. The Corsicans were brilliant manufacturers and exporters, but they needed a distributor on the other side of the Atlantic. They needed a partner who could handle the American end of the operation, and they found one in Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was, by the 1940s, the most powerful organised crime figure in America. He had reorganised the Italian-American mafia, creating the Commission, a kind of board of directors that coordinated activities among the 5 families of New York and avoided costly turf wars. He had survived assassination attempts, earned the respect of his peers, and built an empire. In 1946, after serving time in prison and being deported to Italy as part of a deal with the government, Luciano found himself in exile, but still very much in control of his American operations. And from his base in Italy, he could easily travel to France to meet with his Corsican counterparts. A deal was struck, probably sometime in the late 1940s. The Corsicans would manufacture the highest quality heroin in the world and deliver it to the mafia. The mafia, in turn, would handle everything on the American end: importation, distribution, collection, and enforcement. The smuggling methods were masterpieces of criminal ingenuity. The finished product, packed into 1 kilogram bags, about 2.2 pounds each, had to cross the Atlantic without detection. The methods were as varied as they were clever. Heroin was hidden in the door panels and fenders of brand new Buick automobiles, shipped from Paris showrooms to American buyers. When the cars arrived in New York, mafia mechanics would carefully disassemble them, remove the heroin, and reassemble the vehicles before delivery to unsuspecting customers. It was sewn into the linings of expensive leather luggage carried by well-dressed couriers, often women who were less likely to be searched, on transatlantic ocean liners like the SS France, the SS United States, or the Queen Mary. It was secreted away in barrels of wine, in crates of French cheese, in hollow statues, in false-bottomed crates of legitimate goods. Every shipment of French products became a potential vehicle for smuggling. Once the heroin arrived in New York, the mafia's distribution network took over. Multi-kilo shipments were broken down into smaller quantities by lieutenants, who sold to mid-level dealers, who in turn sold to street dealers. Each level added markup. What cost a few $100s to produce in a Provençal lab would eventually sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars on the streets of Harlem, the Bronx, or South Philadelphia. The profit margins were staggering. A Turkish farmer might receive $300 for the raw opium needed to produce 1 kilogram of heroin. That same kilogram, once refined and transported to New York, might wholesale for $5,000 to $10,000. Cut and distributed on the street, it could generate $200,000 or more in sales. The markup was astronomical. For nearly 3 decades, from the late 1940s through the early 1970s, this pipeline was almost mythically efficient. It was a well-oiled international machine, a shadow corporation with its own supply chain, manufacturing division, quality control, and global distribution network. Estimates suggest that during its peak in the 1960s and early 1970s, the French Connection supplied approximately 80% of the heroin consumed in the United States. The quiet cough medicine, once sold in Bayer bottles, had found new corporate sponsors, and they were far more dedicated, far more ruthless, and far more lethal than Bayer had ever been. Chapter 20. the bust and the aftermath. The French connection seemed impregnable, but all empires, even criminal ones, eventually crack. In 1961, two New York City police detectives, Eddie Egan and Sonny Grosso, began investigating what seemed like a routine case of drug trafficking. They followed a suspect named Pasquale Patsy Fuca, a small-time operator from Brooklyn. The surveillance led them to something far bigger, a major importation operation involving Jean Jahan, a French television personality, and Francois Scalia, a Corsican smuggler. Over the course of several months, Egan and Grosso, along with federal agents, tracked shipments, conducted surveillance, and slowly pieced together the French connection network. In February 1962, they made their move, executing raids in New York and France. The French connection bus seized approximately 24 pounds of heroin, worth millions on the street, but in reality a tiny fraction of the total traffic. Several arrests were made, including Patsy Fuca and his associates, but the kingpins, the Corsican bosses in Marseille, escaped prosecution. The case became famous, immortalised in the 1971 film The French Connection, starring Gene Hackman as Popeye Doyle, based on Eddie Egan. The film won 5 Academy Awards and made the heroin trade a part of American pop culture consciousness. But the actual impact of the bust was limited. The French Connection was disrupted, not destroyed. Operations continued, albeit more cautiously, throughout the 1960s. It wasn't until the early 1970s, under pressure from the Nixon administration and international drug control efforts, that French authorities finally shut down the Marseille labs. By that point, however, the heroin trade had already found a new source. As the French Connection declined, another region was ramping up production, Southeast Asia. The Golden Triangle, the mountainous, lawless borderlands where Burma, Thailand and Laos converge, was about to become the world's new heroin capital, and American soldiers, half a world away in the jungles of Vietnam, were about to encounter heroin on a scale never before seen. Part 7. The Golden Triangle and CIA Complicity. Chapter 21. The KMT Opium Armies. To understand how heroin flooded Vietnam, we must go back to 1949 and the Chinese Civil War. When Mao Zedong's communist forces defeated Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist, KMT government, hundreds of thousands of KMT soldiers fled across China's southern borders into Burma, Laos and northern Thailand, the region that would come to be known as the Golden Triangle. These weren't defeated soldiers quietly retiring into civilian life. They were organised military units, still armed, still commanded by their generals, and still committed to eventually retaking China from the communists. But they needed funding, and the most readily available source of income in the remote mountains where they had taken refuge was opium. The hill tribes of the Golden Triangle, the Hmong in Laos, the Shan in Burma, the Mao in Thailand, had been growing opium poppies for centuries, primarily for local use and small-scale trade. The KMT forces, led by General Li Mi and later by other commanders, organised and expanded this production, transforming it from a cottage industry into an export business. They imposed taxes on farmers, collected opium as payment, and established smuggling routes to Thailand, where the opium could be refined into morphine base or heroin and sold to international buyers. The profits funded weapons, supplies, and the maintenance of their military forces. And then the United States entered the picture. During the early Cold War, the CIA saw the KMT remnants as a potential proxy force against communist China. If they could be armed, funded and organised, they might launch guerrilla raids across the border, destabilising Mao's government. It was a strategy of plausible deniability, using non-American forces to fight America's enemies. The CIA began supporting the KMT forces through a front company called Civil Air Transport, which would later be reorganised and renamed Air America. Ostensibly a civilian cargo airline, Air America was, in fact, a CIA proprietary, owned and operated by the agency to conduct covert operations throughout Southeast Asia. And here is where the story becomes deeply troubling. Air America flights would deliver weapons, ammunition, and supplies to KMT forces in the Golden Triangle. On the return flights, according to multiple documented accounts, they would often carry opium, sometimes with the knowledge of the pilots, sometimes without. The CIA has always denied that it was directly involved in drug trafficking. And to be fair, there's no evidence that the CIA itself was selling drugs for profit. But what is undeniable is that the CIA turned a blind eye to the opium trade, because stopping it would have meant losing the KMT as allies. The geopolitical goal, fighting communism, took precedence over the drug problem. It was a Faustian bargain. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Golden Triangle was producing significant quantities of opium and heroin, much of it making its way to markets in Hong Kong, Bangkok, and eventually Saigon. Chapter 22: Vietnam War and the Heroin Epidemic. When American combat troops began arriving in Vietnam in large numbers in 1965, heroin was already widely available in Saigon and other South Vietnamese cities. Initially, marijuana was the drug of choice among American soldiers. It was cheap, relatively safe, and helped pass the time during the endless hours of boredom between combat operations. But as the war dragged on, as the casualties mounted, as the futility became apparent, as morale collapsed, heroin use exploded. By 1970-1971, heroin had become epidemic among American forces in Vietnam. The drug was extraordinarily cheap. A dose might cost $2 to $5, pocket change even for an enlisted soldier. More importantly, it was extraordinarily pure. Street heroin in American cities was typically cut to 10-15% purity. Heroin in Vietnam was often 90-95% pure, manufactured in labs in the Golden Triangle and smuggled across the border. Soldiers didn't inject it initially, they smoked it, a method called chasing the dragon, where heroin powder is heated on aluminum foil and the vapour is inhaled through a tube. Smoking was less stigmatised than injection, and many soldiers convinced themselves they weren't really addicts because they weren't using needles. But the distinction was meaningless. Smoking high-purity heroin was incredibly addictive, and once a soldier was hooked, the progression to injection was often inevitable, especially when they returned to the United States, where heroin was less pure and more expensive. The statistics were alarming. A 1971 study conducted by the Department of Defense found that approximately 20% of American soldiers in Vietnam had used heroin at least once. Among certain units, particularly those that had experienced heavy combat, the rate was even higher, in some cases over 30%. Conservative estimates suggest that between 10 and 15% of American soldiers in Vietnam became addicted to heroin during their tours. With approximately 2.7 million Americans serving in Vietnam over the course of the war, this meant that somewhere between 270,000 and 400,000 soldiers returned to the United States with heroin habits. Let me tell you about one of them. His name was James Harper, a composite based on dozens of documented cases. Harper was a specialist in the 101st Airborne Division, deployed to Vietnam in 1968 at age 19. He was from a small town in Ohio, the son of a factory worker. He had enlisted partly out of patriotism, partly because college wasn't an option financially. His first months in Vietnam were terrifying. He saw friends killed. He participated in operations that still haunt his memories. He began smoking marijuana to cope, like many of his fellow soldiers. But marijuana wasn't enough to drown out the fear and the guilt and the horror. Someone in his unit offered him heroin, just to try it, just to take the edge off. Harper smoked it on a piece of foil, and for the first time in months he felt peace. The war didn't disappear, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered. There was just warm, safe oblivion. Within weeks, Harper was using heroin daily. By the time his tour ended in 1969, he was physically dependent. He flew home to Ohio to a hero's welcome from his family who had no idea he was addicted to heroin. The Veterans Administration hospitals were overwhelmed and utterly unprepared to deal with the flood of addicted veterans. Treatment programs were minimal. Methadone maintenance, which had been developed in the 1960s as a treatment for heroin addiction, was controversial and not widely available. Harper tried to quit on his own. The withdrawal was unbearable. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He was in constant pain. His family didn't understand. They thought he was just having trouble adjusting, that he needed to man up and move on with his life. He started looking for heroin on the streets of his hometown, but there was none. Small-town Ohio in 1970 didn't have a heroin trade, so Harper moved to Cleveland, where he'd heard he could find it. He did find it, but it was expensive and of terrible quality compared to what he'd used in Vietnam. He started stealing to pay for it. He was arrested for burglary in 1972. In 1975, Harper overdosed in a dingy apartment in Cleveland. He He was 26 years old. His family, devastated and confused, never fully understood what had happened to him. The VA sent a form letter of condolence. Harper's name is not on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., because he didn't die in Vietnam, but the war killed him just as surely as if he'd died in combat. His story was repeated hundreds of thousands of times across America in the 1970s and 1980s. The Vietnam War created a generation of heroin addicts, and American society was completely unprepared to help them. Chapter 23. CIA's Role. Conspiracy or complicity? The question of the CIA's involvement in the heroin trade during the Vietnam War era remains one of the most controversial topics in American history. Official denials have been issued repeatedly. Congressional investigations have found no evidence of direct CIA drug trafficking, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. In 1972, Alfred McCoy, a young historian, published The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, a meticulously researched book documenting the connections between CIA operations and the Golden Triangle heroin trade. McCoy interviewed opium farmers, former CIA operatives, Air America pilots, and drug enforcement officials. His conclusion was damning. While the CIA didn't sell heroin itself, it had actively protected and facilitated the drug trade because the drug traffickers were anti-communist allies. Air America, the CIA's airline, flew regular missions into the Golden Triangle throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. The official purpose was to supply anti-communist forces, the Hmong army of General Vang Pao in Laos, for example, which was fighting against communist Pathet Lao forces. But multiple former Air America pilots later testified that they had seen opium being loaded onto return flights, either with the knowledge of CIA case officers or with a deliberate policy of don't ask, don't tell. The most damning allegation was this: the CIA, in its zeal to fight communism, had prioritized geopolitical goals over American lives. They had allied with drug traffickers, turned a blind eye to the heroin epidemic among American soldiers, and actively obstructed drug enforcement efforts, because those efforts might compromise intelligence operations. In the 1980s, similar allegations would emerge regarding CIA involvement with cocaine traffickers in Central America during the Iran-Contra scandal. Journalist Gary Webb would publish his Dark Alliance series in 1996, alleging that CIA-backed Contra rebels in Nicaragua had helped flood Los Angeles with crack cocaine to fund their operations. Webb was viciously attacked, his career destroyed, though much of his reporting would later be vindicated. The pattern was consistent. When faced with the choice between fighting communism and fighting drug trafficking, the CIA chose the former every single time. The damage to American communities, the hundreds of thousands of addicts created, the overdose deaths, these were acceptable collateral damage in the Cold War. Whether this constitutes a conspiracy or merely complicity is a matter of semantics. The effect was the same. American foreign policy helped create the conditions for a heroin epidemic that would ravage the United States for decades. Part 8. The Golden Crescent, Afghanistan and the Modern Crisis. Chapter 24. The Soviet-Afghan War and Opium. While the Vietnam War was creating hundreds of thousands of American heroin addicts, another conflict on the other side of the world was setting the stage for the next great heroin epidemic. On December 24, 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan, beginning a brutal occupation that would last nearly a decade. The Soviet Union, supporting a communist government in Kabul against Islamic insurgents, sent 100,000 troops into Afghanistan's mountains and deserts. What followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the Cold War, a war that would kill over 1 million Afghans, displace millions more, and ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. But it would also transform Afghanistan into the world's leading producer of opium and heroin. Before the Soviet invasion, Afghanistan had some opium cultivation, primarily in remote regions where farmers had grown poppies for generations. But it was small scale, mostly for local use or limited regional trade. The war changed everything. The Mujahideen, the Islamic resistance fighters battling the Soviet occupation, needed funding for weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The CIA, seeing an opportunity to bleed the Soviet Union through a proxy war, began channeling massive amounts of military aid to the Mujahideen through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) agency. Between 1980 and 1989, the CIA spent an estimated $3 billion supporting the Afghan resistance, one of the largest covert operations in American history. But CIA funding wasn't enough. The Mujahideen commanders needed additional revenue sources, and the most readily available source was opium. Afghan farmers, displaced by war, impoverished, and desperate, began cultivating opium poppies on a massive scale. The crop was drought-resistant, required little cultivation, and fetched high prices. More importantly, it could be grown in regions the Soviets didn't fully control. Mujahideen commanders taxed opium farmers, collected opium as payment, and in some cases directly organised cultivation. The opium was then smuggled across the border into Pakistan, where it was refined into heroin in laboratories operated by Pakistani and Afghan drug traffickers, often with the knowledge, or at least the willful ignorance, of Pakistani intelligence services. The profits were enormous. Estimates suggest that by the mid-1980s, the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, known as the Golden Crescent, was producing approximately 60% of the world's opium supply. Much of this was refined into heroin and exported to Europe, the Middle East, and increasingly the United States. And once again, as in Southeast Asia decades earlier, the CIA found itself entangled in the drug trade. The agency has always maintained that it did not directly traffic drugs and did not condone drug trafficking. But multiple investigations have confirmed that the CIA turned a blind eye to the heroin trade, because stopping it would have meant alienating crucial Mujahideen commanders who were effectively fighting the Soviets on America's behalf. The geopolitical calculus was brutally simple. Defeating the Soviet Union was more important than stopping heroin trafficking. The drug epidemic was acceptable collateral damage in the Cold War. It was the same trade-off the CIA had made in Southeast Asia, and it would have similar consequences. Chapter 25: Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and Heroin. The Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, defeated and demoralised. The occupation had cost 15,000 Soviet lives and contributed significantly to the USSR's economic collapse and eventual dissolution in 1991. The United States had won the Cold War, in part by bleeding the Soviets dry in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan itself was left in ruins. The country descended into civil war among competing Mujahideen factions. Warlords carved up territory, the central government collapsed, and opium production continued to soar, now unchecked by any effective authority. In this chaos, a new force emerged, the Taliban. Initially a movement of religious students from madrasas in Pakistan, the Taliban promised to restore order, end corruption, and implement strict Islamic law. They swept through Afghanistan in the mid-1990s, capturing Kabul in 1996 and imposing their harsh interpretation of Sharia. The Taliban's relationship with opium was complicated and contradictory. On one hand, they condemned drug use as un-Islamic and sinful. On the other hand, opium cultivation was a crucial source of revenue. The Taliban taxed opium farmers, collecting what was essentially a 10 to 20% tax on all opium produced in territories they controlled. This tax, called Usha and Zakat, generated tens of millions of dollars annually for the Taliban government. By 2000, Afghanistan under Taliban rule was producing approximately 4,600 metric tons of opium per year, over 70% of the world's supply. The Golden Crescent had eclipsed the Golden Triangle as the primary source of global heroin. But then, in July 2000, Taliban leader Mullah Mohammed Omar issued an edict banning opium cultivation entirely. The ban was enforced with surprising effectiveness. Farmers who violated it had their crops destroyed and faced severe punishment. By 2001, opium production in Afghanistan had dropped by more than 90% to just 185 metric tons. Why did the Taliban ban opium? The reasons are debated. Some analysts believe it was a genuine religious conviction. Others suggest it was a strategic move to gain international legitimacy and recognition. Still others argue it was an attempt to drive up global heroin prices. The Taliban and their allies had stockpiled large quantities of opium before the ban, which would now be worth much more on the black market. Whatever the reason, the ban lasted less than a year. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda, which had been given safe haven in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, launched terrorist attacks on the United States, killing nearly 3,000 people. The US responded with military intervention, invading Afghanistan in October 2001 and toppling the Taliban government within weeks. Chapter 26. The War on Terror and the Heroin Boom. The post-2001 US occupation of Afghanistan was supposed to bring democracy, development, and the rule of law. Instead, it brought an unprecedented heroin boom. With the Taliban removed from power, opium cultivation resumed immediately and expanded dramatically. By 2007, just 6 years after the US invasion, Afghanistan was producing approximately 8,200 metric tons of opium per year, 93% of the world's supply. The country was effectively a narco-state, with opium and heroin trafficking deeply embedded in the economy, the government, and the insurgency. The reasons for this explosion in production were multiple and interrelated. First, American and coalition forces prioritized fighting the Taliban insurgency over counter-narcotics operations. Destroying opium fields would alienate farmers and push them towards supporting the Taliban. So coalition forces largely left the opium trade alone, except for token eradication efforts that destroyed only a tiny fraction of total cultivation. Second, the Afghan government installed by the US was corrupt from top to bottom. Provincial governors, police chiefs, military commanders, and even cabinet ministers were involved in the drug trade, either directly trafficking or providing protection to traffickers in exchange for bribes. Ahmed Wali Karzai, the brother of Afghan President Hamid Karzai, was widely believed to be one of the largest drug traffickers in southern Afghanistan, though he denied the allegations until his assassination in 2011. Third, the Taliban, now fighting as an insurgency rather than governing, relied heavily on the drug trade for funding. They taxed farmers, protected laboratories, and escorted drug convoys. Some estimates suggest that the Taliban earned $100 million to $400 million per year from the heroin trade during the 2000s and 2010s. Money that funded weapons, paid fighters, and sustained their insurgency. By 2010, opium and heroin accounted for approximately 40% of Afghanistan's entire GDP, an astonishing figure that underscores how thoroughly the drug trade had permeated Afghan society. Farmers grew opium because it paid far more than wheat or other crops. Traffickers got rich, government officials got rich, the Taliban got rich. The only losers were the hundreds of thousands of heroin users around the world who were dying from Afghan heroin. American counter-narcotics efforts were a spectacular failure. Between 2001 and 2021, the US spent over $9 billion on drug interdiction, alternative crop programs, and eradication efforts in Afghanistan. The result was negligible. Opium cultivation continued to increase. The US had created the conditions for a heroin epidemic and then proved completely unable to stop it. And then, in August 2021, the US withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years of occupation. The Taliban returned to power, and the future of Afghan opium production became uncertain once again. Some analysts predicted the Taliban would impose another ban, as they had in 2000. Others predicted production would continue, as the Taliban now relied on drug revenue more than ever. In April 2022, the Taliban announced a new ban on opium cultivation. Early reports suggested the ban was being enforced, but history suggests skepticism is warranted. Afghanistan's opium economy is too large, too entrenched, and too profitable to disappear quickly. Chapter 27. Mexican cartels take over. While Afghanistan was becoming the world's leading opium producer, another transformation was happening closer to the United States. Mexican drug cartels, which had built empires on cocaine trafficking in the 1980s and 1990s, were pivoting to heroin. The shift began in the early 2000s. Colombian cocaine production was declining due to aggressive American interdiction efforts. The Mexican cartels needed a new product. At the same time, American demand for heroin was beginning to increase, driven by the prescription opioid epidemic that was just getting started. The Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was the first to recognize the opportunity. They began cultivating opium poppies in the remote mountains of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua states, regions that were ideal for poppy cultivation and difficult for Mexican authorities to access. The heroin they produced, known as black tar heroin due to its dark, sticky consistency, was lower quality than Afghan heroin. But it had crucial advantages. It was cheaper to produce, and more importantly, it was much closer to the US market. While Afghan heroin had to travel thousands of miles through multiple countries to reach American users, Mexican heroin could be smuggled across the border within hours of production. By 2010, Mexican cartels were supplying the majority of heroin consumed in the United States. By 2015, that figure had reached over 90%. The cartels had essentially cornered the American heroin market. But they weren't satisfied with just heroin. They began experimenting with a new, far more dangerous product, fentanyl. Part 9. The Modern American Epidemic, from OxyContin to Fentanyl. Chapter 28. The Opioid Pipeline. Prescription to heroin. To understand how America arrived at its current crisis, over 100,000 overdose deaths per year, primarily from opioids, we must go back to the 1990s and the rise of OxyContin. OxyContin, manufactured by Purdue Pharma and marketed aggressively starting in 1996, was supposed to be a revolutionary pain medication. It was a time-release formulation of oxycodone, an opioid that had been around for decades. Purdue Pharma claimed that the time-release mechanism made OxyContin less addictive than other opioids because it provided steady pain relief without the peaks and valleys that could lead to addiction. This claim was based on virtually no scientific evidence, but it was repeated relentlessly by Purdue's sales representatives who visited doctors' offices across the country, gave out free samples, sponsored conferences, and paid doctors to serve as consultants who would promote OxyContin to their peers. The Sackler family, which owned Purdue Pharma, oversaw this marketing campaign personally. Internal documents later revealed that they were aware of the addiction potential and the abuse of OxyContin, but they prioritized profits over patient safety. The parallels to Bayer's marketing of heroin a century earlier are striking and appalling. Doctors, reassured by Purdue's claims and incentivized by payments, prescribed OxyContin liberally. Between 1996 and 2010, American doctors wrote hundreds of millions of opioid prescriptions. The United States, with less than 5% of the world's population, consumed over 80% of the world's opioid supply. Millions of Americans became addicted. They weren't street junkies. They were middle-aged people with back pain, elderly people with arthritis, injured workers, post-surgical patients. They were taking medication prescribed by their doctors, trusting that it was safe. And they were walking into the same trap that Civil War veterans and Victorian women had walked into with morphine and heroin. In 2010, facing mounting lawsuits and regulatory pressure, Purdue reformulated OxyContin to make it more difficult to crush and snort or inject. This was supposed to reduce abuse. Instead, it created a catastrophe. Millions of people who had been dependent on prescription opioids suddenly found their preferred drug harder to abuse. Many switched to a cheaper, more readily available alternative, heroin. Between 2010 and 2015, heroin use in the United States nearly doubled. Overdose deaths from heroin soared. The statistics are devastating. In 2000, there were approximately 1,800 heroin overdose deaths in the United States. By 2010, that number had risen to about 3,000. By 2015, it was 13,000. By 2017, at the peak of the heroin epidemic, over 1,500 Americans died from heroin overdoses in a single year. The demographic profile of heroin users changed dramatically. In the 1970s and 1980s, heroin use was concentrated in urban areas and among minority populations. But the prescription opioid-to-heroin pipeline brought heroin to suburban and rural white America. Soccer moms, high school athletes, construction workers, teachers, people who would never have considered using heroin a generation earlier were now dying from it. The epidemic was no longer an inner-city problem that could be ignored by mainstream America. It was killing white, middle-class children. And suddenly, the media paid attention. Politicians declared it a crisis. Resources were mobilized, but by then, the damage was done, and worse was coming. Chapter 29. The Fentanyl Takeover, when heroin wasn't deadly enough. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, invented in 1959 by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen. It was designed for medical use, specifically as an anesthetic for surgery and as a powerful pain reliever for cancer patients. It is approximately 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. A dose of just 2 milligrams, roughly the weight of a few grains of salt, is potentially lethal. For decades, fentanyl was used exclusively in hospitals and was tightly controlled. But in the 2010s, illicit fentanyl began appearing on the black market, primarily manufactured in clandestine laboratories in China and Mexico. The reason cartels embraced fentanyl was simple economics. Fentanyl is entirely synthetic. It doesn't require poppy cultivation, which is labour-intensive, weather-dependent and geographically limited. A single kilogram of fentanyl can produce the equivalent potency of 50 kilograms of heroin. The profit margins are extraordinary. Chinese chemical companies began manufacturing fentanyl precursor chemicals, the ingredients needed to synthesize fentanyl, and shipping them to Mexican cartels. The cartels set up laboratories in Mexico to produce finished fentanyl, which they then smuggled into the United States, often mixed into heroin or pressed into counterfeit pills designed to look like prescription drugs. Users often had no idea they were consuming fentanyl. A person who thought they were buying heroin might actually be buying heroin mixed with fentanyl, or pure fentanyl disguised as heroin. Someone who thought they were buying a Percocet or Xanax pill on the street might actually be buying a fentanyl-laced counterfeit. The results were catastrophic. Fentanyl is so potent that users accustomed to heroin doses would fatally overdose without realizing they were taking something far stronger. Between 2015 and 2021, fentanyl went from being a minor factor in overdose deaths to being the leading cause. The statistics are staggering. 2015, 935,080 fentanyl-related overdose deaths. 2017, 28,466 deaths. 2019, 36,709 deaths. 2020, 56,516 deaths. 2021, 71,238 deaths. 2022, approximately 73,000 deaths. 2023, approximately 75,000 deaths. To put this in perspective, fentanyl is now killing more Americans every year than died in the entire Vietnam War. It's killing more Americans than car accidents. It's killing more Americans than gun violence. It has become the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. And it's not just fentanyl anymore. Cartel chemists have developed even more potent analogues. Carfentanil, which is 100 times stronger than fentanyl and used to tranquilize elephants. Isotonintazine, a synthetic opioid even more potent than carfentanil. And they've begun mixing in xylazine, a veterinary sedative known as tranq that causes horrific flesh-rotting wounds and doesn't respond to naloxone, the overdose reversal drug. The drug supply has become a minefield. Users have no idea what they're actually consuming. Harm reduction efforts, distributing fentanyl test strips, naloxone kits and clean needles can save lives but can't eliminate the fundamental danger. Between 1999 and 2023, over 500,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses, more than the total number of Americans who died in World War II. This is the legacy of Bayer's heroic cure. This is the cost of a century of failed drug policy. This is the price of putting profit over human life, again and again and again. Chapter 30. Faces of the Crisis. Celebrity Deaths and Human Stories. The fentanyl epidemic has killed people from every walk of life. But when celebrities die, the world pays attention, at least briefly. Prince. The legendary musician died on April 21, 2016 from an accidental fentanyl overdose. He was 57. Prince had been suffering from chronic pain for years, likely from decades of performing in high heels and his athletic stage presence. He had been prescribed opioid painkillers and had become dependent. The fentanyl that killed him was in a counterfeit Vicodin pill. He likely had no idea he was taking fentanyl. Tom Petty, another rock legend, died on October 2, 2017 from an accidental overdose of multiple drugs, including fentanyl. He had been suffering from a fractured hip, emphysema and knee problems, and was taking pain medication to be able to perform. He was 66 years old. Mac Miller, a rapper and producer, died on September 7, 2018 at age 26, from an overdose of fentanyl, cocaine and alcohol. He had struggled with substance abuse for years. The fentanyl was in counterfeit oxycodone pills he had purchased. The dealer who sold him those pills was later convicted of distributing drugs resulting in death. Lil Peep, another young rapper, died on November 15, 2017 at age 21, from an overdose of fentanyl and Xanax. He had taken what he thought were genuine Xanax pills. They were counterfeit and laced with fentanyl. These are just the famous deaths. For every celebrity overdose, there are thousands of anonymous deaths. The construction worker who took a fake Percocet for back pain, the college student who experimented with what they thought was oxycodone at a party. the middle-aged woman who relapsed after years of sobriety and died because the heroin supply had become laced with fentanyl. Each death leaves behind devastated families, parents who find their children dead, children who lose parents, siblings, friends, partners, entire communities traumatized by loss. Part 10. Solutions, Hope and the Future. Chapter 31. What doesn't work? Before we discuss what does work, we must acknowledge what doesn't. The United States has been fighting a war on drugs since President Richard Nixon declared it in 1971. The results, after more than 50 years and over $1 trillion spent, speak for themselves. Drug use hasn't declined, drug deaths have increased exponentially, and we've incarcerated millions of people, disproportionately black and brown people, for non-violent drug offences. Mass incarceration doesn't work. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Approximately 450,000 people are currently in prison or jail for drug offences. Putting people in cages doesn't cure addiction. It traumatises them, separates them from families and support systems, and makes it harder for them to reintegrate into society upon release. Supply reduction doesn't work. The US has spent billions trying to stop drugs at the source, destroying poppy fields in Afghanistan, interdicting cocaine shipments in the Caribbean, arresting cartel leaders in Mexico. Every time one source is disrupted, another emerges. Demand persists, and the black market adapts. Abstinence-only treatment doesn't work for most people. Traditional addiction treatment emphasises complete abstinence, never using drugs again. While this works for some people, success rates are dismal, typically 5 to 10% long-term. Most people relapse, often multiple times, and in the fentanyl era, relapse is frequently fatal. Stigma and shame don't work. Treating addiction as a moral failing, blaming users for their disease, and isolating them from society doesn't reduce drug use. It drives it underground, prevents people from seeking help, and increases overdose deaths. Chapter 32. What does work? There are evidence-based approaches that actually reduce harm and save lives. Countries and cities that have implemented these approaches have seen dramatic improvements. Portugal's decriminalisation model. In 2001, Portugal decriminalised the possession of all drugs for personal use. Instead of arresting drug users, police refer them to dissuasion commissions, panels of social workers, psychologists, and legal advisors who assess the person and recommend treatment, if needed. Drug use is still illegal, but it's treated as a public health issue rather than a criminal one. The results have been remarkable. Drug use rates in Portugal are now among the lowest in Europe. HIV infection rates among drug users dropped by 95%. Overdose deaths dropped by over 80%. Drug-related crime decreased significantly. More people seek treatment because they're not afraid of arrest, Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Switzerland had a severe heroin epidemic. In response, the Swiss government launched an innovative program, providing pharmaceutical-grade heroin to severe addicts in supervised clinical settings. Participants receive measured doses of heroin twice daily, administered by medical professionals, along with counselling and social services. The results: crime committed by participants dropped by 60%. Employment rates among participants increased. Health improved dramatically. Many participants eventually reduced their doses or quit entirely. Heroin use among young people decreased. Supervised injection sites, also called overdose prevention sites. These are facilities where people can use drugs under medical supervision. Trained staff are present to intervene if someone overdoses. The sites also provide clean needles, fentanyl test strips, and connections to treatment services. Vancouver's Insight, which opened in 2003, has supervised over 3.6 million injections and reversed over 800 overdoses, with 0 deaths on site. Similar facilities have opened in Europe, Australia, and a few US cities, all with similar success. Medication-assisted treatment, MAT. This involves prescribing medications like methadone, buprenorphine, Suboxone, or naltrexone to people with opioid addiction. These medications reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms, allowing people to function normally while reducing or eliminating their use of illicit opioids. MAT has success rates of 50 to 70%, far higher than abstinence-only treatment, but access remains limited due to stigma, regulations, and lack of trained providers. Harm reduction. This is a philosophy that prioritizes keeping people alive and reducing harms, rather than demanding immediate abstinence. Strategies include needle exchange programs to prevent disease transmission, naloxone, Narcan distribution to reverse overdoses, fentanyl test strips so users know what they're taking, safe supply programs that provide pharmaceutical-grade opioids to prevent fentanyl exposure, non-judgmental education rather than fear-based messaging. All of these approaches have been proven to work. The obstacle isn't knowledge, it's political will and societal attitudes. Chapter 33. The Path Forward. The opioid epidemic is not inevitable. It's the result of specific policy choices, corporate greed, and societal failures. It can be addressed, but only if we fundamentally change our approach. We must treat addiction as a medical condition, not a crime, end mass incarceration for drug possession, hold corporations accountable. The Sackler family, which profited billions from OxyContin, should not be allowed to declare bankruptcy and keep their fortune. Purdue Pharma should face consequences similar to those demanded of street dealers. Expand access to treatment. Every person who wants help should be able to get it immediately, not wait months for a bed in a treatment facility. Implement harm reduction programs nationally. Supervised injection sites, safe supply programs, and naloxone distribution should be available everywhere. Address root causes. Addiction often stems from trauma, poverty, and hopelessness. We need jobs, housing, mental health services, and community support. End the war on drugs. It has failed. Decriminalisation, based on the Portuguese model, is a better path forward. Recovery is possible. Millions of people are in long-term recovery from opioid addiction. They are living productive, fulfilling lives. They are parents, workers, students, artists. They prove every day that addiction is not a death sentence. But recovery requires support, not punishment. Compassion, not condemnation. Treatment, not incarceration. Epilogue. The 500,000 and counting. Take a moment to let this sink in. Between 1999 and 2023, over 500,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses, 500,000 people, more than died in World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. More than died from HIV/AIDS during the entire epidemic. Each one was someone's child, parent, sibling, friend. Each one had dreams, hopes, fears, and potential. Each one mattered. The story of heroin is not just a story about a drug, it's a story about power, profit, and the consequences of putting both above human life. It's about buyer marketing a poison as a cure. It's about the CIA prioritizing geopolitics over public health. It's about pharmaceutical companies lying to doctors and patients to sell more pills. It's about politicians choosing punishment over treatment, stigma over compassion. But it's also a story about resilience, about the doctors and nurses and social workers fighting to save lives every day, about the people in recovery proving that change is possible, about the harm reduction advocates demanding that we do better, about the families refusing to let their loved ones be forgotten. The pattern has repeated throughout history. Profit is prioritized over human life. A crisis is created, and then blame is shifted to the victims. Bayer never truly apologized for heroin. The Sackler family got to keep billions despite Purdue Pharma's bankruptcy. The CIA was never held accountable for its role in the drug trade. This must change. We must demand accountability from corporations and governments. We must implement evidence-based policies. We must treat people with dignity and compassion. The story of heroin isn't over. The epidemic continues. The deaths continue. But now you know the real history. Now you understand how we got here. And with that knowledge comes responsibility to demand better, to do better, to remember those we've lost, and to fight for those who are still suffering. Good night, sleep well, and remember those who couldn't.